Hello there. Welcome to Sumit Academy. I do hope that you have subscribed to my channel. Do subscribe now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. And do remember to like and share this video. In this video, we shall talk about the concept of green governance as a means of moving towards sustainable development. This will be followed by my next video on Indian perspective to green governance. So do not miss out on these two videos. If the human species is going to overcome the many interconnected ecological catastrophes now confronting us, this moment in history requires that we entertain some bold modifications of our legal structures and political culture. We must find the means to introduce new ideas for effective and just environmental protection, locally, nationally, regionally, and globally. We must believe that effective and just environmental protection is best secured through rights-based ecological governance, administered according to principles rooted in respect for nature and fellow human beings. We may call it green governance. We should also believe that the rigorous application of a reconceptualized human right to a clean and healthy environment, or if I may put it in different words, right to environment, is the best way actually to promote environmental well-being while meeting everyone's basic needs. Thus, good governance is ultimately good governance. Achieving a clean, healthy, and ecologically balanced environment requires that we cultivate a practical governance based on, first, a logic of respect for nature, sufficiency, interdependence, shared responsibility, and fairness among all human beings. And second, an ethic of integrated global and local citizenship that insists upon transparency and accountability in all activities affecting the integrity of the environment. To lessen the effects of global warming and to remain below a 2 degrees Celsius increase in this century, national and local government bodies need to proactively coordinate efforts and facilitate development paths that are in line with growth. Of course, without adding pressures on the environment. A smooth transition to a green economy depends upon 7 related conditions, which are both necessary and sufficient to produce substantial changes and which will enable governments to take on a more proactive role in reversing the course of carbon-based activities. Now, these include political commitment, a legal and regulatory foundation, implementation of financial instruments, technological viability, human capital formation, appropriate institutional setup, and a common language. Now let's explain these terms. Why political commitment? Political commitment to the green growth path presupposes that fiscal and monetary tools are used to steer economies away from business as usual. This would include investing in research and development and deployment and commercialization of different renewable technologies in production and consumption activities. Second, importance of legal and regulatory framework. If decisions and policies are not anchored in a binding and enforceable framework, they become merely ornamental in nature. While we do not need to green all regulatory systems concurrently in order to respond to climate change challenges, legal standards must be assessed in a systematic approach. Legal reforms require revisiting existing laws and tuning their jurisdictions through amendments and directives. Third, financial instruments. Policymakers, backed by a regulatory body, have the power to initiate change using three simultaneous measures. Firstly, putting proper mechanisms in place to prevent natural resource use and abuse. This entails re-evaluation of the two types of resource usage, one being resource use intensity and the other the depletion of natural stock. Secondly, government bodies need to re-evaluate subsidy provisions and redirect funds towards ventures that provide permanent solutions to energy security issues. Finally, to reduce the financial risks associated with private green investment, the government should boost their research and development support, providing stimulus packages aimed at increasing the efficiencies of existing systems and supporting the development and demonstration stages of the renewable energy agenda. The fourth condition is technology viability. Even with financial instruments in place, the choice of renewable technologies may prove to be a significant challenge. There are three steps by which choices in technology can be tested. The first of which is to use public funds to support working groups to debate the type of renewable technology most suited to current geopolitical and climatic conditions. Secondly, government funding for frequent sensitivity analysis will enable a clear vision of all options regarding renewable technologies. Thirdly, governments should champion resource gap assessments. Such dialogues promote stakeholders to participate in finding solutions by acknowledging resource gap difficulties. The fifth condition is human capital formation. Investments into human capital is a crucial expenditure that should not be compromised, and as a part of public funding, ought to enhance the know-how, the know what, and the know why. Education, vocational training, and research are extremely vulnerable areas during economic downturns. During recessions, governmental bodies at both local and national levels exercise greater budgetary discretion and often downsize publicly funded activities. Yes, that's right, such as education and training. Stripping educational budgets reduces the value of human capital that could otherwise help to stimulate the economy out of recession. It is during economic downturns that education and other human capital building vehicles need extra support to fund training and facilitate the formation of a cadre that fits the new green ideal. The sixth condition is institutional setup. Institutional adjustments are required, which will adopt and adapt to innovative solutions. Otherwise, institutions will face creative destruction through inaction. The seventh and final condition is common language. Common language entails the standardization of targets, benchmarks, indicators, and measurement units and methods. Moreover, common language is about a unified code of practices, streamlined green accreditation of products and services, and consistent decision-making processes on green issues across government. This is an important criterion as it eliminates the ambiguities and doubts associated with an emerging breed of buzzwords which quickly become redundant and which government officials frequently need to relearn. By and large, instruments ought to be modified by region and reflect local environmental conditions. This may require some trial and error, but more importantly, requires having the necessary human capital base to provide knowledge both of local conditions and on the availability and viability of tools. We now come to sustainable development as an alternative approach to green governance. By the 1980s, there was a realization among the international community that the economic model of development that they were following was primarily responsible for environmental degradation. But the dilemma was that the developing nations needed economic growth to remove poverty and reach a level of prosperity. In an effort to get around the economic environment paradox, the UN General Assembly in 1987 announced the setting up of a World Commission on Environment and Development, chaired by the Norwegian Prime Minister Harlem Brundtland. This commission produced a report, and a very important one at that, and it was called Our Common Future, which identified sustainable development as the solution. Sustainable development reconciled environmental and economic interests by framing them as interdependent. Sustainable development, according to the Brundtland Report, is the development that meets the need of the present without compromising the ability of the future generations to meet their own needs. Please remember this very important definition. This definition emphasized the mutual reinforcing of economic growth, social development, and environmental protection, putting forward a forceful case for a higher level of multilateral cooperation and the need to reform economic practices such as trade, finance, and aid. The report assumed that we can continue on the path of economic development and yet leave enough resources behind for the future generations. Sustainable development, as per the report, is equitable, self-reliant, eco-friendly, economically viable, and long-lasting. Let's have a look at the basic principles of sustainable development. The first is ecological sustainability. An ecosystem that maintains its capacity to support human and other life includes interdependence, biodiversity, and the survival of all species, careful use of natural resources, and interspecies equity. That is, all species are equal. The second principle of sustainable development is social justice. A society that people want to sustain is because it meets their needs. It talks about the basic human needs, intergenerational equity, human rights, and effective participation by the people in taking decisions that most affect them. The third principle of sustainable development is intergeneration equity and justice. Sustainable development suggests that the present resources should be utilized in a sustainable way so that they can also be utilized by the future generations. In that way, it tries to ensure intergenerational equity and justice. Within the present generation, it emphasizes on gender equity in the distribution of resources. The fourth principle of sustainable development is cultural diversity. By protecting the environment, local people's traditions, heritage, and culture is protected. It also believes that local people are the best protectors of the environment, as their survival depends on its preservation and protection. Thus, it suggests applying local knowledge in sustaining the environmental resources. The Brundtland Report changed the discourse of global environmentalism. It tried to chart a middle ground between the North and the South, and between the market liberal and institutionalist views on growth on the one hand and social, green, and bioenvironmentalist views on the other. It proposed a global development and environment strategy designed to be acceptable to all. It did not see further economic growth and industrialization as necessarily harmful to the environment, and thus did not foresee any necessary limits to growth. At the same time, it argued, very much in line with Third World sentiments at Stockholm, that poverty harmed the environment as much as industrialization. This poverty was in large part due to the pace of developing economies within the global structure. The best way to move forward, the report contends, was to promote economic growth, not the kind of growth seen in the 1960s and 1970s, but environmentally growth. Thus, the report provided a balanced approach to harmonize relations between environment and development. The Brundtland Report also reflected the developmental concerns of third world nations. It supported the transfer of environmental technologies and economic assistance, so developing nations could afford to pursue sustainable development and economic growth. The other significant recommendations of the report were control population growth, promote education, ensure food security, conserve energy, foster urban sustainability, and develop a cleaner industrial technologies. The recommendation of the report found widespread support among many nations and multilateral economic situations, since the report stressed that effective environmental protection rested on continued economic growth. The concept of sustainable development propounded by the Brundtland Report is now part of the mainstream national and international policies and developmental planning. The Brundtland Report prompted the UN General Assembly in 1989 to approve a follow-up conference. The 1992 UN Conference on Environment and Development, held in Rio de Janeiro, recognized the need to couple together the two issue areas and was a much larger and more diverse gathering than in 1972. Now, why is this important? It is important because this is known as the Earth Summit. It brought out 5 major commitments. First, the Rio Declaration. It contains 27 principles on how nations should conserve environment. Second, treaties on climate change. It talks about reduction in the greenhouse gases by nations. Third, conservation on biodiversity. It has 3 main objectives: conservation of biological diversity, sustainable use of biodiversity, equitable sharing of benefits arising from their use. 190 nations have signed the agreement, and out of that, 130 are enforcing the same. Fourth, forest principles. It contains 17 principles for international cooperation on forests and forest resources. Due to the conflict between developed and developing nations, these principles did not come into force. Fifth, Agenda 21. This is a blueprint of action plan to achieve the goals of sustainable development, containing 40 chapters. It has 4 sections, that is, social and economic dimension, conservation and management of resources for development, strengthening the role of major groups and means of implementation, a number of nations have taken the responsibility of implementing the action plans. The most well-known of the treaties negotiated in the years following the Earth Summit was the Kyoto Protocol 1997 to the UN Framework Convention on Climate Change. The protocol called for individual commitments by industrial nations to reduce emissions of 6 greenhouse gases by 2008 to 12, which were expected to lead to an overall reduction of greenhouse gas emissions to levels 5% below the 1990 levels by 2008 to 12, the so-called first commitment period. There was a dispute between the developed and the developing nations on the cut on the level of emissions. The developing nations were of the opinion that their economic conditions do not allow them to follow the protocol. They also stressed that the level of emissions are much lower in comparison to the developed nations. The United Nations called for a new summit to review the commitments of Rio and to rekindle fresh political and financial commitments for sustainable development. As a result, the World Summit on Sustainable Development was held in Johannesburg, South Africa in 2002, 10 years after the Rio Earth Summit. The conference was the biggest UN meeting ever. Over 180 nations and 100 heads of state attended the conference. The major outcome document, the Plan of Implementation, contains targets and timetables to spur action on a wide range of issues, include access to clean water, proper sanitation, preserving biodiversity, phasing out of toxic chemicals, and increasing the use of renewable energy. However, the conference failed to embrace new verifiable goals or to advance significantly efforts for the protection of the global environment. Next came the United Nations Climate Change Conference 2015. Held in Paris, France. The conference negotiated the Paris Agreement, a global agreement on the reduction of climate change, the text of which represented a consensus of the representatives of the 196 parties attending it. The agreement will become legally binding if joined by at least 55 countries, which together represent at least 55% of global greenhouse emissions. Such parties will need to sign the agreement in New York and also adopt it within their own legal systems through ratification, acceptance, or approval. In the 12-page document, the members agreed to reduce their carbon output as soon as possible and to do their best to keep global warming to well below 2 degrees centigrade. The agreement established a global stock take which revisits the national goals to update and enhance them every 5 years, beginning 2023. However, no detailed timetable or country-specific goals for emission were incorporated into the Paris Agreement, as opposed to the previous Kyoto Protocol. Though the conference could not achieve its desired objectives, it shows the consistent concern of the international community to protect the environment with their collective efforts. Thus, the journey of green governance has traveled from Stockholm 1972 to Paris 2015 in a hope to collectively address environmental challenges. A number of international conferences and summits have taken place during this period. However, the international community has not been able to achieve its desired goals. There are two barriers in the way. First, there is a conflict of interest between the developed and the developing countries. Second, global policy stands in stark contrast to domestic environmental laws, which result in the non-implementation of international commitments. Governments are still prone to take blinkered decisions, informed by short-term economic interest in the face of long-term utilitarian calculations of national interest, as has been clearly seen in the US stance on climate change. See how quickly the present president of US has backtracked from the Paris Agreement. Let us talk about a recent phenomenon which is sweeping the world and finding a place in our country too. This is the concept of green consumerism. This is closely related to the notions of sustainable development or sustainable consumer behavior. It is a form of consumption that is compatible with the safeguard of the environment for the present and for the next generations. It is a concept which ascribes to consumers responsibility or co-responsibility for addressing environmental problems through adoption of environmentally friendly behaviors, such as the use of organic products, clean and renewable energy, and the research of products produced by companies with zero or almost negligible impact. In these days of information technology, increased media coverage of environmental problems such as acid rain, greenhouse effect, land degradation, and ozone layer depletion has enlightened consumers, manufacturers, non-governmental organizations, local environmentalists, and government about the threat posed by humans to the environment. In response to the rising demand for eco-friendly products and the attention paid by the consumers towards environmental credentials of companies, the companies started incorporating environmentalism in their policies. Some of the companies adopted environmental friendly stance proactively in the wake of their social responsibility, while others envisaged the opportunities from the growing environmental awareness to explore new markets. Consumerism, a movement to protect consumers against dangerous products, unethical pricing practices, and deceptive advertising, has increased in the recent years, and protection of the environment is one of them. The main issues pursued by the consumer movement fall into three categories, that is, environmental protection, product performance, and safety and information disclosure. Major forces driving the movement, in addition to consumers themselves, are consumer organizations and other interest groups, consumer education, and consumer laws. Green consumerism aims at protecting the consumers against environmentally harmful products and practices. It has increased the interest of consumers in environmental impacts of the products they buy. Green consumerism progresses through four stages, beginning with the superficial awareness of green issues, for example, acid rain, and ending with an acceptance of individual responsibility for the environment and a commitment to buy only green products. Ultimately, the green consumer becomes the green agitator, joining an environmental group to lobby for change. Thus, the rising consciousness towards the natural environment is a new trait among the consumers that is fast catching up. However, greenness among the consumers is not only difficult to identify because a consumer may not act green in all the circumstances, but also it is difficult to measure since all the consumers are not all equally green. Therefore, it becomes imperative to identify the environmental issues and problems that the consumers are aware of as distinguished from those that are not known to them. Such information can be helpful to the marketers in identifying the target consumers and also deciding as to what are the environmental features of a product that need to be highlighted to satisfy a particular consumer segment. Moreover, marketers as well as non-profit organizations concerned with the promotion of environmental causes can identify the environmental issues and problems that need to be propagated among the public. This will enable the governmental and non-governmental agencies promoting environmental ideas to focus their education efforts on those environmental hazards or impacts which the consumers are not aware of, rather than wasting their efforts on those issues that are already popular among the consumers. However, not much work has been done in this direction in our country. As far as the consumers are concerned, though environmentalism may not have hit the Indian consumers directly, the people here are fast adopting an alternative lifestyle by using products like health foods, organic vegetables and fruits, natural textiles, vegetable dyes, herbal cosmetics, handmade stationery, traditional Ayurvedic medicines, and less polluting fuels. Indian consumers may not always be buying out of environmental concerns, but health, which is a bigger motivating factor as far as purchases of safer food products are concerned. Health foods are supposed to be devoid of preservatives, chemicals, and artificial colors. As far as consumption of fuel, electricity, and water is concerned, a major role is played by the cost factor. People generally conserve energy resources to save money than to ameliorate environmental problems. And it is also true for the recycling activities undertaken by households. Thus, there are numerous issues and developments that require attention of government, non-governmental organizations, and marketeers. The consumers are not equally green. Therefore, there is a need to not only explore whether they are aware of environmental issues, but also to identify the issues they are aware and unaware of. This would help the interested groups to formulate strategies to inform and educate the consumers about the environmental impacts of their actions. Consumers too need to play an important role in order to achieve such sustainability. Consumers can do their bit by buying eco-friendly products with eco-friendly packaging. Check for the carbon footprint of the product. Buy natural and herbal products as much as possible and make sure that the product's whole life cycle is sustainable. India has been long aware about the perks of using natural herbal products due to its Ayurvedic heritage, and recent awareness among the Indian consumers has further enhanced green consumerism in the country. The Brundtland Commission had correctly stated in 1987 that sustainable development is the development that meets the needs of the present without compromising the ability of future generations to meet their own needs. Consumers' awareness about eco-friendly products and the environmental impacts affect their green consuming behavior, and this growing feeling of responsibility for the environment needs to be tapped for a healthier environment for us and for the generations to come. In conclusion, we may say that governance of the natural environment in the world of today has emerged as one of the most complex challenges ever faced by humanity. The variety of environmental changes generated by human activities, from the local to the global levels, are not new. However, the magnitude of the diverse changes and the resulting impacts on the functioning of the natural ecosystematic processes grew very rapidly over the past 2 centuries, and more so in the second half of the last century. The Stockholm Conference on the Human Environment in 1972 turned out to be a watershed event in the recognition of the challenges in environmental governance by the global community. Since then, the environment became increasingly internalized in the governance agenda at all levels of governance. Well, that's all from me in this video. In my next video, we shall discuss the Indian perspective to green governance. This video is based on the information freely available on the internet. No originality is claimed for the same. The intention of this video is only to prepare candidates for answering examination questions on the subject. Do like and share this video, and do subscribe to my channel now so that you do not miss out on my previous or future videos. And in case you wish to drop me a line, you will always find me at sumitacademy20@gmail.com. Till later then, cheerio.